WWE is truly the mecca of professional wrestling. But then, given the fact that they've been around since the 1960s, perhaps the promotion's growth in global reach should come as no surprise. Of course, they wouldn't have gotten here were it not been for their various top stars drawing in new fans over the years. Yes, more so than anyone else, it's the wrestlers themselves that have helped the company reach new heights. However, there can only be one top performer of each year, one person who stands out above everyone else as the very best wrestler of each specific 12-month period. But who were these performers? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into the best wrestler of every year in WWE history. And to start, we're going to journey all the way back to 1963 when Vince McMahon Sr. broke away from the National Wrestling Alliance and formed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And during the newly fledged promotion's first 7 years, there was one wrestler that established the company as a viable brand more than anyone else, that being none other than Bruno Sammartino. Yes, starting in 1963, Sammartino would defeat Buddy Rogers to become the WWF World Champion, and across the years which followed then, he'd continue to hold that belt with pride. It didn't matter if it was Gorilla Monsoon in 1964, Gene Kiniski in 1965, Killer Kowalski in 1966, Giant Baba in 1967, The Sheik in 1968, Ivan Koloff in 1969, or George the Animal Steele in 1970, they all stepped up to the champ and they all fell in short order. So it should come as no surprise then that during this 8-year period, Bruno became a hero and an icon to not only Italian Americans everywhere, but to all wrestling fans. That said, for as dominant as he was throughout the first decade of WWF's existence, his run on top couldn't last forever, and eventually some young lion was going to come looking for his spot. And while he held on for as long as he could, ultimately Sammartino's day would come when, in 1971, a new top dog presented themselves in the form of Pedro Morales. But what happened here? Well, after losing the WWF title to Ivan Koloff, the now former champion took some time away from the company, and that allowed a new babyface star to rise in his absence, as by the end of that year, Pedro would be standing tall with the belt around his waist. And this continued into 1972 as well as it happened, because there, the Puerto Rican native underwent a series of successful title defenses against the likes of Freddie Blassie, Stan Stasiak, and Ray Stevens. Of course, for most people, such a punishing schedule would have worn them down after a while, but come 1973, Morales was still going strong and still carrying the company on his back, with further defenses against opponents such as Mr. Fuji and Larry the Axe Hennig. That said, 1974 would see a return to the old ways once more, because after his record 2,803-day title reign had ended and he'd been forced to take some time away to recover, Bruno Sammartino returned with a vengeance this year so as to reclaim his lost gold. And in doing so, he would continue to hold on to this belt throughout 1975 too, as there, now reinvigorated, he'd fend off the likes of Nikolai Volkov, Lord Alfred Hayes, and Captain Lou Albano, all while continuing to be a man of such class and dignity that the entire company could be built around him all over again. So that was why when 1976 came around, he still felt as strong as he ever had, both in the minds of fans and in the mind of his boss, Vince McMahon Sr. So strong was he, in fact, it seemed impossible that he'd ever lose the belt again. And that was apparent in his various successful title defenses against names like Bobby Duncum, Jimmy Valiant, and Blackjack Mulligan. By 1977, however, change was in the air once more, and at this point, all the hard work finally caught up to Bruno, and so with his body and mind being worn down, he ultimately fell to the best performer of that year, superstar Billy Graham. That's right, well, up until then, a heel had never served as anything more than a transitional champion in WWF. Graham was just so charismatic and talented that Vince McMahon Sr. decided to run with him throughout the entirety of the year. But then how could he do anything else when he had someone on his roster who, despite being a heel, came across like pro wrestling's version of Muhammad Ali? And that wasn't just because of his in-ring skills either, but also because of his ability to trash talk on the mic. After all, as he constantly let fans know, he was the man of the hour, the man with the power, and someone who was simply too sweet to be sour. Still though, even with the heel champ being a charisma machine, New York remained a babyface company in the long run, and so that was why, once a new superstar in the form of Bob Backlund arose in 1978, he'd take the mantle and carry the company going forward. Yes, after winning the WWF title that year, Backlund set up shop at the top of the card and, from there, made it clear he wasn't going to be vacating his post anytime soon. And while he may not have been as charismatic as its precursor, Bob's All-American values and impressive amateur wrestling skills were enough to see him outshine everyone else on the roster here. Sure, others would continually try to usurp him and take the spot for themselves, but as 1978 bled into 1979, he continued to reign strong as he defended against big names such as Peter Maivia and Ernie Ladd. Hell, even as Vince McMahon Jr. purchased the company in 1980 and began the process of transforming it into the World Wrestling Federation, Backlund continued to be the MVP as he defended against all comers. And this was even more impressive, because with the new boss having wildly different ideas for the direction he wanted to take the industry going forward, the fact that he stuck with Bob at the turn of the decade showed just how valuable he was. And 1981 would be no different here, even if the boss was already searching for his next top guy. Backlund proved himself invaluable again with his defenses against performers like Stan Hansen, Sergeant Slaughter, and Don Morocco. Of course, by 1982, however, a new generation was beginning to bubble up, so this meant Backlund had to work that much harder if he wanted to continue being the best thing about WWF, even if by then, bigger, more colorful stars were making themselves known. That said, he was able to do this, with him holding on to the world title for the entirety of that calendar year. And 1983 was no different, as, now in his 6th year as world champion, the Minnesota native didn't slow down one bit as he defended his belt valiantly against Big John Studd, Afa, Tony Atlas, and countless others. Unfortunately for him though, by the end of this year, he'd have finally dropped the title to the Iron Sheik. And so with him moving away from the main event scene at this point, it left the door open for a new top guy to rise up in his absence during 1984. Who are we talking about here? Why, Hulk Hogan, of course. Yes, this was now the Hulkamania era of WWF, and the period which saw it explode into the mainstream. And of course, one of the primary reasons this happened was because Terry Bollea was there at the top of the card as the red and yellow clad Superman who could catch the attention of children everywhere. And he'd continue to do so well into 1985, as there, at WrestleMania 1, he and Mr. T introduced the world to the Rock and Wrestling Connection in 1986, going around the house show circuit, drawing record crowds against the likes of Rowdy Roddy Piper, Terry Funk, and Jesse the Body Ventura. But it would be 1987 where his toughest test yet happened, because after being tasked with putting on a show so good it would draw 93,000 people into the Pontiac Silverdome, he went one-on-one with Andre the Giant and proved yet again that there was no bigger star in the entire industry. Of course, at this point, you'd think the only place there was to go was down then. But for the Hulkster, that wasn't an option. And so he'd continue to push things even further when his rematch with Andre on the main event drew a record 33 million viewers and a 15.2 in the key demo. That said, at this point, a screwy finish would see his 1,474-day run with the top prize come to an end. And as a result of this then, he began to rethink where his priorities lay. So when 1988 rolled around, Hogan had started shifting his attention to Hollywood, with him at this point taking some time away from TV to go film some movie roles, leaving a vacuum behind in his place. But it wasn't as if WWF was without a banner star this year, because in Hogan's absence from the top spot, it would be left to another fan-favorite superstar to pick up the baton, something Macho Man Randy Savage was only happy to do. And he'd do this by becoming the WWF World Champion for the first time after winning a one-night tournament at WrestleMania 4. But it wasn't like he had a clear path towards staying on top forever though, because despite being the champion, he'd always feel like he was in the shadow of the Hulkster when he returned later that year. And when in 1989 the Hulkster felt he was ready to resume his spot at the top of the pecking order, he'd set about regaining his lost gold. But in doing so, he'd have to sever the union he'd formed with Savage as, at WrestleMania 5, the Mega Powers exploded. Of course, in the end though, it would be Hulk who came out on top as the undisputed best the company had to offer, and still the biggest star in the industry, with him doing so in a moment which, to many, represented the peak of the golden era storytelling. So, with such a high watermark having been reached here, Vince McMahon knew there was nowhere left to go but down for Hogan, and that was why he set about looking for his next top guy at this point. And as it happened, he'd find exactly this in 1990 when he crowned the Ultimate Warrior as his new WWF champion. Unfortunately though, despite being massively over here and even scoring a rare clean pinfall victory over Hulk Hogan, the Warrior's flame would burn out quickly. Yes, even sharing the ring with top-tier opponents like Ravishing Rick Rude and Mr. Perfect couldn't keep him on top forever, as at the end of the day, he just didn't have the temperament required to stay where he was. Not that this takes away from how much of a superstar he was throughout the year though. That said, by 1991, it was clear things were no longer working, and so Vince McMahon was forced to fall back on the man who continued to be a reliable top guy whenever he was needed, and that was the Hulkster himself. Yes, it didn't matter how popular Jim Hellwig was, in the end he simply wasn't a match for Hulkamania. But even if Hogan continued to carry WWF throughout 1991 as its best performer, he was still reaching the end of his run by now, and so someone new was going to need to take his place eventually. And that's why it was lucky then that in 1992, with the steroid trial meaning the muscle men of WWF's golden era were quickly becoming a thing of the past, Vince McMahon was forced to pivot and go with an all-new type of star in Bret Hart. That's right, this was the move towards the new generation era, an era which would focus more on in-ring skill and athleticism than big muscles and cartoon Supermen. And during the early days of this era, no one represented such an ethos better than the Hitman. How did he do this? By having the best match on the card of any given night and proving that no matter who he was tasked with wrestling, he could make them look like a star. Hell, so good was he that it looked like the boss's mind had finally changed on the idea that only people 6'4" in height and 300 pounds in weight could carry the company going forward. Not that Vince was done with big men altogether though, because despite Bret's unparalleled greatness, even he was overshadowed when, in 1993, YOKOZUNA absolutely dominated the industry. And he did this by beating both Bret and Hulk Hogan at various points for the WWF title, then by going on a lengthy reign on top, which saw everyone in his path get absolutely destroyed. But for as much of a force of nature as Rodney Anoa'i was, WWF was still a babyface company at heart, and so that was why, by 1994, Bret Hart would have regained his spot as the top guy and clear best performer New York had after putting on a pair of 5-star classics against his brother Owen at WrestleMania 10 and SummerSlam respectively. That said, 1995 would not be as strong a year for the Hitman as, with him losing the WWF title and, from there, being stuck in the mid-card for much of the period, it was left to another top babyface to rise up as the best wrestler of the year, and that was Diesel. Yes, back in 1995, there was arguably no one more over than Kevin Nash. And this was because, with his cool guy persona, he quickly won the hearts of fans everywhere. Still, even if he was popular and very charismatic, he was never really the box office success as a champion that the company had hoped he might be. But then this can't be entirely blamed on him because the mid-90s were a notoriously difficult period for WWF, with there being pretty much no one who was able to draw. And that wouldn't get any better as the next year came around because, with Vince McMahon's promotion now becoming a distant second in the Monday Night Wars, partially as a result of Diesel's defection to WCW, there was a desperate struggle to find someone who could carry things going forward. Thank God then there was a man who'd been bubbling up for years at this point, someone who finally got the chance to show the full extent of what he could do here. Who are we talking about this time? Why, Shawn Michaels, of course. Yes, it was during this year that HBK's coming out party as arguably the best wrestler in the world finally occurred when he achieved his boyhood dream of winning the WWF title at WrestleMania 12. That said, for as great as he was, at this point, WCW were so popular on account of the burgeoning NWO storyline that no matter how good of a performance Michaels put on, WWF was still regularly being killed in the ratings. So as 1997 rolled around then, it was clear something new was going to be needed if the New York company wanted to continue. And luckily, they had just the guy to steer them in a winning direction, as this was the year which saw the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Sure, 96 had been the period where he became the king of the ring, but 97 was the real breakout moment for the Rattlesnake, as after having arguably the greatest match of all time against Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13, he'd become the great anti-hero of his time when he went after absolutely everyone, heel or babyface. Hell, even Vince McMahon felt his wrath at one point during a now iconic segment where Austin gave the boss a stone cold stunner. And the feud continued between these two into 1998, as with the Attitude Era now in full swing and wrestling becoming more popular than ever, Stone Cold stood right at the helm of the ship as the WWF champion and constant bane of Vince McMahon's life. But the good times didn't end in 1998 though, as with the mainstream popularity the company was enjoying carrying on over into 1999, Austin vs. McMahon would continue to draw record crowds, and the Rattlesnake became even more of a pop culture phenomenon as a result. Seriously, by this point, he was arguably the biggest star in all of wrestling history, even more so than Hulk Hogan. Of course, by the end of the year though, he'd have to take some time out to recover from neck surgery. And that meant during 2000, the door would be open for the man who very much served as the yin to Austin's yang, The Rock, to briefly become the new face of the company. Of course, if there were any concerns he wouldn't be able to meet the standard Stone Cold had set, this was quickly proven wrong as Rocky became arguably an even bigger mainstream star himself. And he backed all his talk up in the ring too, with him spending most of what many still consider to be WWF's greatest year ever as world champion. That said, by 2001, another star would have risen to take Dwayne's place as the best wrestler on the roster. But then, given how much of a prodigy Kurt Angle was, perhaps it's no surprise he found so much success so quickly. Hell, so good was he, after less than a year of being in the ring, he was already WWF champion. And throughout 2001, he proved to be deserving of all the accolades which were thrown his way by being able to stand toe-to-toe with other, more established workers such as Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, and Eddie Guerrero. But even Kurt was no match for what was to come next, because in 2002, it would be all about a once-in-a-generation talent named Brock Lesnar. And what made Brock so special was that everyone could see from minute one that he was destined to be a superstar. So much, in fact, that after less than 6 months on the roster, WWE, as it had now been rebranded, was forced to give him the undisputed world title and let him run with the ball. Still though, one person who wasn't happy about being overshadowed by this newcomer was Kurt Angle. And that was why, as 2003 came around, he'd return with a vengeance, putting on some of the strongest work of his career and even regaining the WWE title from the Beast at one point. But it wasn't just his rivalry with Lesnar which made him the best of this year. No, it was also his stellar bouts against the likes of John Cena and Eddie Guerrero. That said, come 2004, it would be the latter opponent who had usurped him as being WWE's top worker, because this was undoubtedly the year of Latino heat. How could it be anything different though? After all, this was the period where Eddie had one of the greatest feel-good moments in company history when he defeated Brock Lesnar to win the WWE title. And on top of that, it was also the year where he made a star out of JBL in one of the bloodiest encounters ever seen inside the square circle. Sadly though, in late 2005, tragedy would strike. And so, with him no longer being there to carry the torch, it was left to the next face of the promotion to rise up and collect it. Yes, 2005 was the beginning of John Cena's rise. And at least during those early days, fans were very much behind John as he went into WrestleMania 21 and won the WWE title from JBL. Of course, the real test of his mettle came soon after this, however, as when many adult males in the audience began to turn on him, he had to work all that much harder if he wanted to prove he deserved this spot. Thankfully then, he was more than up to the challenge as, during 2006, Big Match John continued to be the franchise player during his feuds with the likes of Edge, Triple H, and Rob Van Dam. And even if there was a certain section of the fan base who still refused to get behind him, the West Newbury native was so good in his role, it didn't stop him from continuing to be the key player in Vince McMahon's arsenal all the way into 2007 as well. Hell, at this point, he'd even managed to have good matches against opponents such as Umaga and the Great Khali, with all of this going to prove that, even back then, Cena was better in the ring than most people gave him credit for. But all good runs must come to an end eventually, and so it was that, by the time 2008 rolled around, someone else had usurped John as the best performer in WWE. That said, given how much of a career-defining hot streak Randy Orton was on at this point, there was no way anyone else was going to best him in this category. No, this was the age of Orton, the year when Randy became the most evil and sadistic heel the promotion had seen in years. And with that came a lot of accolades for him, as not only did he win the WWE title, but he also main evented numerous pay-per-views against the likes of Triple H, Jeff Hardy, and Batista. Of course, his reign of terror would come to an end the following year though, as after years of having been one of the best wrestlers in the world, Triple H was finally able to call himself the cream of the crop in 2009. And he did this by not only main eventing WrestleMania 25 with Randy Orton, but by also defeating him there to retain his WWE title. And even when he wasn't challenging the Viper, the game was having an absolutely standout period, as alongside Shawn Michaels, he helped to get the Legacy's Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase Jr. over to the next level during the feud between the four men. Come 2010 though, Triple H's time as a full-time in-ring competitor would be winding down. And so seeing this, John Cena took the opportunity to push himself back to the forefront, as throughout that calendar year, he once again proved why he was the franchise player. Yes, after a couple of years of being somewhat overshadowed by Orton and the game, Big Match John returned with a vengeance when he spent much of this year trying to get the Nexus over. And while the group didn't really last in the long run, it wasn't for lack of trying on the champ's part, as he had multiple pay-per-view encounters with the heel faction at this point, all while he was continuing to be the biggest draw the industry had. That said, it can't be ignored that as 2011 rolled around, many fans were beginning to tire of the era of Cena, and were instead looking for something new and fresh. So it's just as well then, in the summer of this year, a new top star would rise to the forefront, with this being none other than CM Punk. But then, after he delivered his now iconic pipe bomb promo, there was no hope anyone was ever going to outshine him here. No, even a Summer of Punk angle, which was eventually botched, couldn't kill the momentum of the voice of the voiceless, as he became the man who brought back many lapsed fans for the first time in a decade. And heading into 2012, he'd continue this momentum, because with him now in the midst of a 434-day world title run, there was simply no stopping him. No, it didn't matter if it was John Cena, Ryback, or Chris Jericho, everyone fell to the champ as he became the firm favorite of the people. That was until 2013 though, because if Punk had become a superstar during the years prior, this was the period where Daniel Bryan ascended to the level of godhood in many fans' minds. Yes, never before had there been such an aggressive fan movement to see one person be placed in the main event. And with audiences getting behind the American Dragon so much here on account of his peerless wrestling skills, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the days of Bret Hart, it meant that, after having been considered wrestling's best-kept secret for years prior, Bryan became the main eventer he was always destined to be. And while WWE fought against this for the longest time, by the point WrestleMania 30 came along in 2014, they were forced to give in and have the Aberdeen native win the big one by beating Triple H, Randy Orton, and Batista all on the same night. That's right, what began in 2013 reached its climax in 2014, and despite spending much of the year out with an injury, Daniel Bryan was still the clear star player of the year on account of what he did during its early months. Come 2015 though, things would change, as with the American Dragon being forced to enter temporary retirement, it would mean that the man who had in many ways taken his place in Ring of Honor would become the next MVP of WWE, and that's Seth Rollins. And yes, you could make an argument for any of the three members of the Shield here, because with the mid-2010s in a lot of ways being defined by their meteoric rise, it's hard to argue against Dean Ambrose or Roman Reigns too. For our money though, what put Rollins over the edge here was that this was the year he became WWE Champion after cashing in his Money in the Bank contract at WrestleMania 31. And as if that wasn't enough, from there, he'd go on to spend most of the year on top of the mountain, ahead of all the other big names on the roster like John Cena, Randy Orton, and Brock Lesnar. Alas though, in the winter of that same year, the Architect would fall to an injury and would have to vacate that very title he held so dearly as a result. Thankfully then, as 2016 began, a man who had very much served as his equivalent in both TNA and New Japan Pro Wrestling for many years would make the jump over to WWE, and that was AJ Styles. Of course, at this time though, even if he was a two-time IWGP Heavyweight Champion, a three-time NWA World's Champion, and a two-time TNA World Heavyweight Champion, most assumed the Phenomenal One would be relegated to a mid-card role under Vince McMahon's watch on account of his relatively short stature. And that's what makes it all the more impressive then that, by the time the summer was over, he'd be crowned WWE Champion after the boss became so impressed with his in-ring skills, he realized he had no other option. Yes, as pretty much the second coming of Shawn Michaels, AJ proved he belonged in the upper echelons of WWE in record time. That said, for as standout a year he had in 2016, putting on a series of classics against John Cena, he was always going to be a placeholder for the man the company had pegged as their next face, and that was Roman Reigns. Was 2017 the year he reached his full potential though? Not quite. And sure, while many fans didn't get behind him at first, with all this leading to a very vocal backlash, it was undeniable to those who were able to see through the fog of hatred that Reigns was an incredibly talented performer. Hell, even when he was getting booed out of arenas everywhere, he was still having excellent matches against the likes of Samoa Joe, Braun Strowman, and Brock Lesnar. Come 2018, however, the sheer level of anger being directed towards him at every turn saw WWE ease back on his push for a while, as instead, they returned to the man they knew could step up to the plate whenever he was needed to, and that was AJ Styles. But then, given how good a 12 months the Phenomenal One had here, it's no surprise he'd be a shoo-in for the best wrestler in the company. And what made this year so special for him was that now, firmly established as a main event player and after 2 world title runs, he felt comfortable enough to where he could return to his roots by forming the club with Luke Gallows and Carl Anderson. So with them by his side then, Styles set about elevating the mid-card when he won the United States title and successfully defended it against the likes of Ricochet, Cedric Alexander, and Humberto Carrillo. That said, for as great as he was, he wouldn't be the man who dominated the conversation in 2019. No, as it happened, it would be no man at all who dominated the year, as instead, for the first time, a woman would become the company's MVP when Becky Lynch rose all the way to the top. And sure, it might have started in the second half of 2018, but it wasn't until the following year when Lynch's meteoric rise was fully solidified after she became part of the first ever women's WrestleMania main event, there defeating both Ronda Rousey and Charlotte Flair to become the undisputed women's champion. Following that then, she'd go on the run of a lifetime, keeping hold of the Raw Women's title for the rest of the year and well into the next. And as we moved into the new decade, the year 2020 saw Roman Reigns fully come into his own after he turned heel and morphed into the Tribal Chief, the leader of the Bloodline and the top dog in all of wrestling. Yes, despite being hampered by shows taking place in front of no live audience, Reigns somehow managed to excel. In fact, you could argue that the very fact that there were no crowds helped him to reach that next level initially, as it allowed him to play more quiet moments of acting, such as his performance during his Hell in a Cell bout with Jey Uso. Had he not been able to do this then, and had his subtle emotions been drowned out by the noise of the crowd, maybe he wouldn't have gotten over as strongly as he did. So in that sense, he managed to make the lockdown work for him in a way few others could. And as 2021 came around, Roman continued to go from strength to strength, as with fans now returning to arenas, the head of the table became what WWE had hoped he'd be all along, a generational star big enough to truly pick up the mantle left behind by John Cena. Hell, not only was he now the best character in the company, he'd also evolved into being one of its best wrestlers, as could be seen in his matches against the likes of Edge, Daniel Bryan, Kevin Owens, and Brock Lesnar. And things didn't slow down for him the following year either, as in 2022, Reigns only further solidified his spot as the best wrestler in the company when he beat Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 38 to become the undisputed WWE Universal Champion. Of course, it wasn't all about the titles he held by now though, because with the bloodline growing to include honorary Uce Sami Zayn, it became the best storyline the promotion had done on purpose since the summer of Punk over a decade prior. And with this storyline now peaking as 2023 rolls around, it means there's really no option for MVP other than for us to select Roman Reigns again. Could someone new step up to make the remainder of 2023 their year? We'll have to wait and see. Maybe Sami Zayn or Cody Rhodes. Or will it be someone new like Braun Breaker? Well, that remains to be seen. But one thing we can be sure of is that if anyone wants to usurp the champion and take their spot amongst the ranks of everyone else we've talked about today, they're going to have to earn it, because it's not a position which comes easy.